Welcome, everyone. We're going to discuss the state of Against Mandela today. I'm Lynn Anderson, Associate Professor of French at UWG, and I'm really happy Dion Cade is joining us to discuss the film. He's editor and documentary filmmaker with over 15 years experience. His video and documentary work has appeared at numerous festivals in the US and abroad. He's been at UWG since 2012, where he is film and video production head and associate professor. We're really happy today to have questions that were generated from students who watched the film. And we have, as Professor K goes through these, he will elaborate and I'll pitch in as well. So our first question, first of all, before we start, Professor K, do you have any introductory thoughts or not?
No, I think I appreciate the introduction and thank you for inviting me. I'm happy to be here.
Okay, our first question generated by a student. This person wrote, although this is labeled a documentary, would you say it is any other genre? I got the feeling of more of a drama. In my opinion, it just gives more than a documentary.
Okay, I will try not to talk too long because I feel like I could take up all our time answering this question because it is a subject matter very close to my heart, and to answer the question, it all comes back to what you think a documentary is and what you think a documentary can be. And I think a lot of people, when thinking about documentary and talking about documentary, particularly people who are still learning about it and or not necessarily who have been steeped in that world, think of documentaries as only being one thing, one type of film, but I think it's more effective to think of documentary more as a proto-genre than actually a very specific targeted type of film like you would a comic book movie, for example, or a romantic comedy, right? When you go see a comic book movie or a superhero movie, you're expecting certain type of formulaic conventions because that's what the genre tells you to expect. Same with the romantic comedy, same with the horror movie. It doesn't work with documentary because as a form, it is so broad, and it's like saying, when I think of documentary, I think of a narrative movie, right? So when you say I'm going to see a movie, the question is, hey, what type of movie is it? It's the same with documentary. It's like, this is a documentary. It's not like only one type of thing. It's like, what type of documentary is it, right? Because there's so many genres, subgenres and types of documentaries and forms and styles and modes that fit within the documentary format. So if you're expecting a collage of talking heads, people sitting down like with interviews, you're missing out on what else a documentary can be. So while this film, the State Against Mandela and Others, is not a traditional documentary for the most part, although it has some elements of traditional documentary built into it, it is still very much rooted in actuality, rooted in what we can call the truth, things that happen, things that are. And but there's also a creative interpretation in terms of the way it is presented visually, particularly with the animations, and I'm sure we'll talk about that later. But and that's okay. And when I say it's okay, it makes the form of documentary richer, and perhaps it's more useful and accurate to talk about documentary as a form than as a genre.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it does seem to combine a number of different elements, so that's very helpful. Another student wrote, in the movie, there are different images, such as the people being interviewed, images from events in the past, and the illustrations. What would be the impact of the film without the illustrations? what images would replace the illustrations? And what is the significance of the abstract and geometric figures in the illustrations? And the disproportionate size and shapes of some between the prosecutors and the accused.
Okay, so there's a lot wrapped up in that question. So I will try and address it all, and please let me know if I miss anything. To start off with the significance of the interviews, obviously not everyone who was involved involved in the Rivonia trial is still alive and accessible at the making of this film. So just being able to interact with them and incorporate them in the film is a really important way to pay homage to their sacrifices that they made, right? And accomplishments as well, and what they went through. It would be conceivable to make a version of this documentary without involving them, but it would be, I feel it would be something of a betrayal to the struggle and the sacrifice that these people have made. Now, finding the balance between how much interview to incorporate and how little is a tricky thing, because you don't want to dismiss the participants in any way, and you want to respect and acknowledge their participation in the history and the struggle. But at the same time, sit-down interviews are the least visually interesting element of documentary filmmaking and filmmaking in general. And again, one should really think about documentary filmmaking as just another kind of filmmaking. And at the end of the day, it's about story. It's not so much about information. So it's a visual medium. It relies heavily on visuals, and sit-down interviews are not particularly visually interesting. So one needs to find other ways to, on a very base level, illustrate the silence, the emptiness, like the empty visual space, right? How do you fill that with things that are visually interesting? And like the entry level is to illustrate, right? To show what is being heard at the same time, to reinforce that. And that's fine. It's kind of what we come to expect particularly with reenactments, for example, but it can feel like an exercise in illustration rather than something that is a visual story in its own right, a visual elements that can hold up. So ideally we end up with something where we have really powerful audio and images that can each work on their own independently, but then when you put them together, they transcend the power of the power of the individual elements. So if we have one and we have one, we put them together, we ordinarily think 1 + 1 = 2, but in this case, an ideal version of that, 1 + 1 = 3, right? And that's the idea of transcendence. And I think the animations in this documentary really do work that way. I said in my introductory video that we're very lucky to have access to this historical text, right? The audio recordings, but to just animate the court case wouldn't do necessarily justice to the bizarreness of the situation. And I say bizarre, surreal, Kafkaesque, because it was a historical moment in time that was heavily influenced by propaganda. The state controlled all access to the media. The media was radio and newspapers at that point, but it was an incredibly brutal and oppressive regime, right? Where the judge, this giant animated figure, is explicitly, that's you can't do that with physical, with live action illustration, with reenactment, but kind of as a metaphor for the outsized power that the judge had in that situation, and it's completely applicable, right? The state was much bigger than individuals. There was no such thing as democracy in that country in that time. And so the reality of the historical context is that power was very much distorted and very much abused. And what the animations allow you to do is distort reality and represent the power dynamics and the injustice in a way that you cannot necessarily do with live action.
Right, and I agree with that. The animations are very powerful, and it's amazing the strength that continues to be made by the participants in the trial against the constant barrage of interrogation by the prosecutor. Another question is, it's fairly similar. The student asked, do you think the style of this film is better than a reenactment? And again, that's maybe a judgment call, but what would you say? Is there something you can add to that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in this case, I think the answer is yes, because we're dealing with an environment that has to us, it seems almost a surreal element to it, right? Just in terms of the power relations, how these celebrity freedom fighters on trial, but also once you get arrested, you sort of disappear into this vacuum of the state that you don't necessarily have access to fair legal representation or fair representation before the law. So in this case, the animations really do represent the world that these people were fighting against. Could one create reenactments? Yes. Would it be as effective in this particular case? I don't think so, because reenactments tend to be kind of staged and canned. Again, more with a leaning towards literal visual illustration of what's going on in the audio space. And the two, to my mind, the two best ways to counter that, one is to just stay away from it completely in terms of reenactment. The other is to lean into the superficiality of it, and there are filmmakers who have done that very successfully. Most famously, Errol Morris, whose documentary "The Thin Blue Line" is also crime related, but not political crime and not court case, but about eyewitness testimony. There were two gentlemen in a car, one of whom killed a police officer, and they were his word against his, basically. And this documentary, through incredibly stylized reenactments, kind of goes through the different testimonies from the different eyewitnesses and kind of recreates and reenacts the situation from everyone's different point of view, to call attention to the fallibility of memory and how specific everyone's experience of situations are. And as an intellectual exercise, it's incredibly fascinating. As an intellectual exercise on memory and perception, it's fantastic. As a kind of a seminal documentary in terms of calling into question the role of reenactment, it's also incredibly powerful. But the third and even most successful element of that documentary is that Errol Morris actually contributed to getting the real killer arrested, and the falsely accused killer, who had been falsely imprisoned, was subsequently released from prison because of the work done surrounding this documentary. So it's a credible example of of an academic and intellectual and artistic exercise that actually has tangible real world outputs. Another documentary that Errol Morris executive produced that premiered, I don't know if it premiered in Toronto at the Toronto International Film Festival in November, but that's where I got to see it. It's called Enemy of the State. And similar to the State Against Mandela, they have a lot of audio recordings from interviews. And what they did is to further stylize the reenactment process. They had the people who were interviewed sort of come back years later and sit down and recreate the interviews that they were subject to, but using exactly the same words and lip syncing to the originally recorded audio. Mm-hmm. So, so it would be the equivalent of me sitting here pretending, like lip syncing to statements that I had made, 4 or 5 years ago, like audio recordings. And so it's me saying these words, but it's me pretending to say these words that I said before. Mm-hmm. And it's adding a level of superficiality. And it's, again, that's kind of pushing this reenactment and the stylization element to a new level. And I think that's more, again, that's more of an intellectual and an aesthetic exercise than it does really create a compelling documentary. But again, is it more interesting to try something unique and that hasn't been done before, rather than defaulting to something that's a little purely illustrative? And it's a hard thing to illustrate something that you don't have access to the visual world, right? When you're dealing with just audio mm-hmm. recording, like how do you fill that visual space? But going beyond the pure illustration is always a good idea.
Right. And so again, they did a good job of that in this film. And those are great examples. The Thin Blue Line, and then the other one regarding the other, not really reenactment, but the other approaches to that kind of thing. Another student asked this question. The directors present the case of Mandela and the others in an efficient and effective manner. How could they have further gained the audience's attention without losing the effect of the message about the trial? Could other techniques besides animation have been done to ensure that the full story was covered? And could these techniques include more of the storytelling from the perspective of the accused? And one thing that occurs to me is it seems like they did try and dive into the accused perceptions at the time and then retroactively. But what are your thoughts about that?
In terms of engaging with the accused today, I did say that sit-down interviews are the least visually interesting part, but I will say that just in terms of interacting with the accused, getting them, seeing them is really important. Giving, valuing their participation, valuing their input, valuing their experiences. But also, it's less about the talking. It's more about the humanity and the emotion on their faces as they're listening, and that sort of teaches us who they are a lot more, because we learn so much. In terms of this documentary, we learn possibly enough about them through their participation in the trial and the audio recordings. But just their moments of their just being is incredibly powerful. And as I said a little while ago, it really depends on aligning the style of the visual storytelling with the subject matter. So, in the case of the Thin Blue Line, as I mentioned, this is very, a lot of stylized reenactments that works very, very well for the kind of story that Errol Morris is telling in that documentary. Would stylized reenactments work in a documentary like the State Against Mandela and others? It's hard to say because I think this documentary works really well and the animation was a really wonderful selection. But I don't know, maybe perhaps because I feel particularly close to the subject matter, I feel like reenactments would devalue the historical reality of the situation and the struggle and the suffering that people went through. So I feel like it's right to not try and reenact this, but it could work. And I also want to bring up another documentary. There's other poetic ways to fill visual space. There's another of my favorite documentaries of a certain style is called About a Son. It's about Kurt Cobain, who was the lead singer of Nirvana. And there is a music journalist, Michael Azerrad, who over a long period of time recorded hours and hours and hours of interviews with Kurt Cobain and the other band members, writing a book called Come As You Are, which is kind of the official history of the band Nirvana. Then after Kurt Cobain died, the audio recordings were tied up in estate litigation for a long, long time. And so it wasn't until probably about 12 years after Kurt Cobain's death that the tapes were released and ownership was established. And AJ Schnack got his hands on the tape and started making a documentary, but sort of like the state against Mandela and others, dealing with a vast amount of audio material, but zero visual material to accompany it directly. And this is obviously about a musician and an artist and a very different subject matter, right? So the approach to making this documentary was to edit these long, rambling late night interviews that have a very kind of meditative and sometimes hallucinogenic quality to them. It's just, and the approach was to just go around like Olympia, Washington and Seattle, Washington. And I can't remember some of it, maybe in Los Angeles but these were like Kurt Cobain's old stomping grounds, and just film these long, slow, meditative shots of the environment and the cities and even close-ups of people, and shot on film, and not like high-end like Hollywood film, but like it's shot on 35 millimeter film, but still it's it's called like a faster film, so it shows up a little grainier, and it's got a slightly more kind of historical quality to it. It's a little more ethereal. It's not like crystal clear high definition video that we're looking at, and it like the quality of the images, in addition to the subject matter of the images, aligns so perfectly with this audio. And it's mesmerizing and it's hypnotic. And in this case, it's a very wonderful and effective combination of visual material and audio material in a way that is truly transcended. A version, I've wondered if something like that could have worked with the audio material from the court case of the Rivonia trial. And that would change the film completely, because there's one of, you run the risk of filming what is often referred to as poverty porn, perhaps, if you're doing environmental shots of South Africa, and it also becomes critical of the struggle, perhaps, in that South Africa still has a lot of problems. Apartheid is not one of them, but the legacy of apartheid is definitely still one of them. But it becomes a different film if you're making it about the Rivonia trial, or if you're making it about the legacy of apartheid, right? If you're making a film about the legacy of apartheid, you don't need to center it around the Rivonia trial. The Rivonia trial is just one small chapter in a long and really brutal history. but the Rivonia trial as a historical moment deserves its own documentary, but I think focusing on the aftermath, focusing on subsequent successes and shortcomings of the current democratically elected government kind of would, in this case, dilute the power and the historical import of this film.
Thank you for that analysis. It's really interesting to consider what that might have been like, but I agree that it probably would have diluted the impact somewhat. And then finally, here's our last question, unless we wanted to go further with others. A student writes, with the lack of pictures and videos from the trial, do you think it was a way to further prevent the public and the world from knowing about the trial? And to my mind, and maybe you have some insight into this, I think it's amazing that these audio recordings do subsist because they are an incredible document. But what are your thoughts about that question?
So, we're looking at 1964. Radio existed in South Africa. Television did not. There were no film cameras around there. But, but in that moment in history, I don't believe it was common for court cases to get documented in any substantial way. So it is rare and surprising. And I do not have insight into how these recordings came about. My guess is that someone went rogue in a sense and understood the import of the situation and went out of their way to create a historical artifact. But oppressive regimes are very curious things because many of the times they serve as they contribute to their own undoing in many ways. And we saw the Nazis' rigorous record keeping just allowed people to understand the magnitude of what they did, but also the individuals related to these awful events. So it also is very possible that this was recorded to use for bragging rights, right? To show off to the world how that this is a legal trial. We could edit this in a way that shows that due process was followed, or as a way to show that, hey, if you break the law, we will prosecute you and there's nothing you can do about it, right? Control of truth is a very, very powerful weapon. So, and by creating this document, there was, the potential to edit and manipulate the historical account of this event.
And those are all really interesting reflections because, my take, I guess if someone had gone rogue, they got a great recording, right? The audio quality is really pretty good.
Yeah,
Must have been seated right there, maybe placed the microphone right up at the. And
it's not likely. And when I say gone rogue, I'm not talking about like a hidden recorder like we're able to do today. I'm talking about someone convincing their boss that, hey, this is going to be good for us for our propaganda machine. Meanwhile, they saw the potential for it to serve other purposes as well. Again, we don't know why it exists. I don't have insight to it. I know.
And no, I agree with that. I think they probably thought about it in terms of putting on display that they were in fact doing the right thing. They were trying to show the world that they were enforcing their laws and so on. And finally, at the end, something that occurred to me was that I was struck by the inauguration of Donald Trump being shown in a televised fashion as the participants had come together for a discussion. And I found that really, it was just really chilling because it seemed as though it was there to portend that, even though the progress has been made in South Africa, perhaps authoritarian tendencies were coming about in other parts of the world, in particular the United States. But I thought that was really amazing that the director had chosen to do that, and yet did it in a very subtle way. There was no dialogue about it. But and frankly, when it was portrayed, and the one piece that I saw that was more of a close-up of the television screen was there was a very brief exchange between Obama and Trump during that inaugural process, but otherwise it was just in the background. And so I thought that also was very, very striking. The one frame that showed a close-up of that. But your reflections on that portion of the movie?
Yeah, I think on a very on a superficial level, that moment is just helping to situate the making of the documentary in a historical moment. This is the time period, but I think it transcends that definitely. I think it's almost a convenient byproduct is that it gives us access to, hey, this is happening at this moment in time. There is a much more chilling and overarching impact that this has, that is very much tied to the constant struggle against oppression and injustice, and dare I say, fascism. But it's it very much so, and as someone who has spent half their life in South Africa and half their life in this country, I'm constantly drawn to the similarities and in terms of equality and racial justice. And the United States, is a lot further along off from slavery than South Africa is from apartheid. And in this country, we are still very much dealing with the legacy of that, right? And so much of what we have seen recently in this country with Black Lives Matter and police violence stems from, it's the long tail of slavery, even though there have been many other historical moments in this country of where racial equality or inequality have peaked and surfaced. It stems from there, and we're a long way off of slavery, and we're still dealing with the legacy here. South Africa's 30 years past apartheid, so it's hard again to criticize too strongly the current South African government for the speed of change, and that's a reason why I think this documentary makes the right decisions to situate it focused around the Rivonia trial rather than the legacy of it. But in terms of the footage tied into kind of the relating to the political circumstances in this country, it is chilling. I think you used that word maybe today, maybe the other day when we chatted, but it is a chilling reminder that there is always work to be done, and it's I don't know, one needs to be vigilant constantly, I guess.
It definitely sounds a warning or an alarm and something that resonates both in South Africa and the US and really worldwide on all those issues that you touched on.
Yeah, because everything that happens in this country resonates around the world in a way that South African domestic policy mostly always has not really transcended its borders. South Africa is a very small country, but it's also very resource rich. And during apartheid, there were political and economic sanctions, and South Africa was completely self-sufficient in terms of nothing was imported, because nothing could be imported at that time. But Even like there's figured out how to make gasoline out of coal, because South Africa is very rich in coal, but the only thing South Africa didn't have was oil. But so again, it's pretty isolated, but South Africa actually did serve as this is so terrible to think about, but there were delegations from the South who visited South Africa during apartheid to try and understand how they so effectively disenfranchised Black people, because it is something that, you know, in the 60s they wanted to mimic in the South.
Right. That is pretty, that's beyond terrible. And that was in the 60s that happened? Was that Senate delegations or other groups?
I would have to look into that to get you the details, but
again, that as well is very chilling
but it is, it's one of the few kind of moments during apartheid where South Africa was seen in a favorable light. that I know about, but for the most part, South African policy did not necessarily transcend. Now, obviously, it's an economic powerhouse in Southern Africa, and it's one of the two largest economies on the continent of Africa. So it has more. It has more levity in a multinational circumstance. But obviously nowhere near what goes on in this country has intense global impact, and everyone is following it. Everyone follows the news here more closely than they possibly follow the news at home. Well, not everyone, but it's as easily accessible. And if you look at the BBC, you look at domestic news in South Africa, there's always American politics is always on the front page. And that's particularly in the last few years when we've seen, we saw the beginning of it at the end of the documentary, but sort of we were reminded about the start of that era politically.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for your commentary. Are there other issues you would like to raise with regard to the film or the context?
I have a question, I guess, that I would like to leave students with that I've been thinking about. So we've touched on the fact that there was state-run media in South Africa, like complete lack of transparency and access to information, right, where the government gets to control what is the truth, which is obviously a tried and true system of oppression that we have seen throughout history, commonly known as propaganda. But something that I have been thinking about in relation to this documentary is the difference between having access to too little information and having access to too much information. Like if the net result of these two things are different. And I'm thinking specifically in the context of this fake news / post-truth world that we are living in, where during apartheid South Africa, the government gets to decide what is true and people have to follow along. What we have here is groups of people being able to decide what their own personal truth is, regardless of evidence to the contrary. And again, it's because there is so much information, and on one hand, like a lot of behavioral psychologists will tell you that everyone experiences the world differently, and truth is kind of malleable, but there are certain things that certain gravity items, right? You can choose not to believe in gravity, but it's not going to stop gravity from working on you. Unfortunately, there are a lot of things that if you get enough people to coalesce around an idea, you do get to create truth that way. And I use the word truth sarcastically, but it's an artifact of having too much information. So just in terms of understanding and thinking about the difference between, not necessarily the difference in the net result of having access to too little information and having access to too much information.
I mean, that's a key question right now, because you're right, people can coalesce around different media sites and form their own form of the truth. So, great question to leave our students with, and thank you to our students for all of your questions. Thank you to Professor K for your presence here today and discussing the film in context. And we really appreciate your thoughts, and we appreciate your watching. And we go back and watch this again if you haven't already. And thank you again for joining us.
Take care. Thank you.